Hi, welcome to this lecture titled Your First Program. This is the first lecture on the Python programming language. We're going to be spending the rest of the course talking about the Python language. Here's the outline for this lecture. We'll first talk about a very simple program in Python, and I'll walk you through the structure of that program. And then we will discuss a very important concept, which is that of input and output. Now, when we write our Python programs, we're going to use a specific programming environment. Okay, so the programming language is going to be Python, which is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the course. We will use a very simple editor called idle for writing our Python programs, and this is a very simple environment which is called the Integrated Development Environment, or IDE for short. Okay, there are many such IDEs out there, and idle is a fairly simple such IDE. Okay, so that's what we would use to write our Python programs, and then to run the programs that we write, we are going to use the terminal. Okay, and finally we will use the input and output libraries from the authors of the Python text that we're going to be using. Okay, so again, we will write our programs in Python. We will write those programs using an editor called idle, which is what is shown here. So for the screenshot shows the idle editor with a very simple Python program loaded in it. And then we will use the terminal, which looks like this, to run the program. So what is shown here is how you run this particular program on the terminal, which then produces some output. Okay, so that's how we will be running our programs using the terminal. And then we're going to be using the input and output libraries written by the authors of our text. Okay, so that's the environment. Now, in order to program in Python, what you do is you first write your program by typing it into a file that usually has the .py extension. So for example, that file might be called helloworld.py. Okay, and we're going to be using this editor called idle to write our programs. So this is what you will use to compose your programs, such as helloworld.py. And once that is done, the next step is to run that program or execute that program. And the way you do that is by typing this command, python3, which is called the compiler or the interpreter. That's what's shown here, along with the name of the program that you wrote, which is helloworld.py in this case. Okay, so you run this command in the terminal window, and you get the output of that program, okay? Whatever the output was meant to be. Okay, so that's the workflow. We're going to write our Python programs using idle, a very simple IDE or editor. And then we feed that program as an input to the compiler or the interpreter, which is called python3, and we get the desired output. Okay? And if we are not content with this output, then maybe something is wrong with the program that we wrote. So we go back and fix it, and then run the modified program, and so on and so on. Okay. So writing a program is an iterative process. All right, you're never going to get it done, the first time around. You constantly have to go back and change your program until you get an output that you're satisfied with. Okay. All right, so that's how we're going to write and run our Python programs. Now let's talk about our very first Python program, and this program is going to be called helloworld.py. So it's defined or written in a file called helloworld.py. Okay, and what the program is supposed to do is simply write a very simple message called the hello world message to the standard output or the terminal. So when we say standard output, we are essentially talking about the terminal, so aka terminal. Okay, so what the program does is it simply writes this message, hello world, to the terminal. That's what you expect to see when you run this program, hello world.py. Okay, so now let's look at this program. So the program is extremely simple. It simply consists of 4 lines of code, all written inside a file called hello world.py. Okay, so we will carefully walk through these 4 lines in a bit. But before that, let me just show you how you run this program. Okay, so you run the program, as I said before, by invoking the compiler or the interpreter for Python, which is called Python 3, along with the name of the program. Okay, and you do this on the terminal, and this $sign, remember, is the prompt. So you simply type this command and hit enter, and the program comes back with the output, which in this case is the hello world message, right, written to the terminal. So that's how this program is run. All right, and this is our very first Python program, a simple one that simply writes the hello world message to the terminal. Okay, so now what we'll do is carefully walk through this program and look at its structure, right? So the first line in hello world.py is a statement called import stdio. So it's a statement that tells Python that you intend to use features defined in this module. All right, so what you put after import is a module name, and by importing this module, you're simply telling Python that you plan on using some features from this module. All right, and later on we'll talk about exactly what that feature is that you're using. So that's the very first line. It's the import statement, which simply imports a module whose features you're planning on using in the rest of the program. Okay, what's the next line? The next line is a blank line. And Python ignores blank lines. It doesn't care about blank lines. So what's the purpose of a blank line? Well, it's basically used by programmers to separate logical blocks of code. All right, so that makes the code more readable. So if you have several blocks in your code that do slightly different things, meaning they're logically separate, then you typically put blank lines between them just to make the code more readable. Okay, but Python simply ignores those blank lines. All right, what about the third line? Well, any line that starts with a hash sign is a comment. All right, so the third line is basically a comment, and comments are again ignored by Python. So what's the point of having comments? Well, that's just for human consumption, so that someone reading your program can make sense out of it, all right, by looking at the comment. So comments again are ignored by Python, but it's a very good practice to include comments in your program so that someone else that is reading your code can follow along. Okay, what's the last line in the program? Line number 4. Well, that's the all-important statement that simply prints the message hello world to the terminal. Okay, and the way we achieve that is by calling what is called the writeln function. So this is a function, okay, from the stdio module, all right, that writes this message, which is an argument to the function, to the terminal. Okay, so what the function writeln does is it simply takes this argument message hello world and writes it to the terminal. All right, and this is the feature, writeln is the feature that we are using from this stdio module. So we had to tell Python that we need this module later on. All right, and the way you tell that is by using the import statement that we talked about earlier. All right, so writeln writes out this message, and this ln means write a new line character at the end of the message. Okay. Later on, we'll see there is another version of write where we don't write a new line character at the end. But this particular version, since the name of the function is write_ln, it not only writes the message, but it also writes a new line character at the end. So there is a hidden new line character here. All right, which is why when you run this command, you will see the prompt being returned back to you on a new line. All right, so the prompt is not going to be showing up there, but it shows up there. That's because this write_ln has written a new line character after the hello world message. So there is a new line character sitting here that you can't see. Okay, so that's the structure of this Python program. It simply has 4 lines of code. The first line is the import line that tells Python that we plan on using features from this module. The second line is a blank line, which is ignored by Python. It's just to make the code more readable. The third line is a comment, again ignored by Python. It's only for human consumption. And the fourth line in this case is a statement which calls the function write_ln from the stdio module to print this message hello world to the terminal. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about a few more things about Python programs. Now, whenever you write a program in Python or any other language, be prepared to deal with errors. Okay. So errors, also known as bugs, are the bane of a programmer's existence. So you're going to be confronted by errors all the time when you write programs. All right. Now there are different types of errors. There are compile time errors, which are raised when Python compiles a program. So for example, in the previous program, if you forget to include the right parenthesis in the line where you call the write_ln function, then that results in a compile time error. So for example, if you say something like stdio.write_ln of hello world, but if you forget this right parenthesis, which is part of the syntax, then that's a compile time error. Okay, so this is now an error, and it's a compile time error. It's a syntax error. Okay. And then you can also have what are called runtime errors, which are raised when Python interprets your program. All right. So when Python runs your program, when it comes across an error, that type of an error is called a runtime error. So for example, in the previous program, if you forget the import statement, if you don't have that first line that said import stdio, then when the program gets to stdio dot write_ln blah blah blah, then Python has no knowledge about this function. All right, because you forgot to import the stdio module. All right, so if you want to use a function such as write_ln, you have to tell Python where it actually belongs. So write_ln belongs to stdio, so you need to import stdio. And if you fail to do so, that results in an error that we call a runtime error. Okay, so that's what I'm saying here. So if you forget to import the stdio module in hello.py, that results in a runtime error. Okay, so these are two broad categories of errors that you typically have to deal with when you write programs. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about a very important concept, which is that of input and output of a program. All right, so a program, any program, Python programs in our case, can be looked at as follows. So you can think of a program such as myprogram.py as a box, right, that contains some Python code and that expects some input from the user and produces some output. All right. Now a program is meaningless or useless if it doesn't take input from the user and it doesn't produce meaningful output. Okay, a program doesn't respond to user input or produce meaningful output is a useless program. All right, so pretty much every program that one writes takes user input and produces output. Okay? Now, in this course, we are going to look at different types of input and output. For input, we are going to focus on three types. One is command line argument, which is what we're going to talk about next. And then later on in the course, we'll talk about what's called standard input. And then towards the end of the course, we will also discuss what's called file input. Okay? But we will start with the very simple type of input called command line arguments. All right? Okay, so that's for input. What about output? Well, for output, we're going to talk about standard output, meaning simply writing to the terminal, which is what the Hello World program did. It wrote the Hello World message to the terminal or standard output. Later on in the course, we will talk about file output, meaning how you write to a file that you can use later on. And then we will also discuss other types of output, such as graphical output, meaning how do you draw something on the screen, and also audio output, meaning how do you generate sound signals, how do you manipulate sound signals. Okay, so we'll discuss how you basically do signal processing, sound signal processing. All right, so these are the different types of input and output that we're going to consider in this course. Command line arguments, standard input, and file input for input types, and standard output, file output, graphical output, and audio output for output types. Okay, but we're going to start with a very simple type of input called command line arguments. So what are command line arguments? Well, command line arguments are basically inputs to a program, and the way you specify them is by simply listing them right next to the program name when you run the program. So for example, if your program is called myprogram.py, the way you run that is by saying Python 3 myprogram.py, and then you can list any number of command line arguments or any number of inputs by just listing them next to the program name. Okay, so this is the first command line argument or input, this is the second command line argument or input, and this is the nth command line argument or input, and they're all separated by spaces. Okay, all right, so that's how you specify these command line inputs or arguments to a program. So the question is, a natural question to ask is, how do you access them within the program? Well, it's extremely straightforward. You access them within the program via an array or a list. So we're going to talk about these things later on in the course. So you access them via an array or a list that is called sys.argv. So sys.argv is a list or an array and a list is basically a container or a data structure that holds a whole bunch of values. And this particular list called sys.argv holds the command line arguments. Okay, so the way you get hold of the first command line argument inside your program is by saying sys.argv square brackets 1. So this is how you index or extract an element from a list. Here you're extracting the first element of the list. So sys.argv of 1 is basically talking about arg1. Similarly, sys.argv of 2 is basically referring to arg2. So that's how you'll get hold of arg2 inside your program. And then finally, sys.argv at n gets hold of the nth command line argument. Okay. So that's how you get hold of these command line arguments inside of your program. In order to get the ith command line argument out inside the program, you simply say sys.argv of I. All right. Now just keep in mind that in Python, the name of the program itself, which in this case is my_program.py, is stored as the 0th command line argument. So sys.argv of 0 is essentially the name of the program. Okay, and we typically don't make use of the 0th command line argument or the name of the program. Okay? Instead, we just look at command line arguments starting at 1. All right. But just keep in mind, the 0th command line argument is the name of the program. All right. Now, a few comments. the first thing is the sys module, okay, provides access to variables and functions that interact with the Python interpreter. So for example, sys.argv is basically a list that contains the command line arguments to the program, if any. All right. Now, sys is a module, so if you're writing a program that needs to get hold of some command line arguments, then you need to import the sys module. And how do you do that? Well, very easy. So you say import sys, all right? Just like how we did import stdio in the hello world.py program. So again, if you write a program that expects command line input or command line arguments, you need to import the sys module, because only then you will be able to refer to sys.argv to get hold of the command line arguments. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, the other comment that I want to make is that these arguments, they're all of type strings. All right, so we'll talk about type in the very next section, but for now just keep in mind that command line arguments, they all have type string, and a string is nothing but a sequence of characters. Okay, and you separate the command line arguments with spaces, any number of spaces. Okay, but what if you want a space inside of your command line argument? Well, in that case, you simply enclose it in quotation. All right, so you can use double quotes and put some values here. So for example, Alice space Bob. So this could be a command line argument to a program, but notice that since we have double quotes around this sequence of characters, it is basically a single command line argument, though there is a space in between. All right. So what I'm saying here is that if you have a command line argument that has a space in it, one or more spaces, then you need to embed that command line argument inside of double quotes. Okay, because if you drop the double quotes, then this is going to be interpreted as two command line arguments, separated by this space. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So now what we're going to do next is talk about a very simple program that makes use of command line arguments. All right. So this program is called useArgument.py. And what it does is it takes a name as input from the user. So it takes a name as a command line argument. And then for output, it's simply going to write a message that contains that name. All right? And it's going to write it to standard output or the terminal. So again, the input for the program is a command line input, a name, and the output is simply going to be a message, a greeting, basically. It's going to greet the person with that name, right? And write that greetings message to the terminal. Okay, so let's walk through the program. The first thing that we do is we have a couple of import statements. We import stdio. Why? Because we need to write some message to the terminal. Okay, so we're going to be using the features from stdio to do that, to generate output. Then we import sys. Why do we do that? Well, because we need to read a command line argument or the name from the user. Okay, so we need to make use of sys.argv, which is defined inside of sys, so we import sys. And then we have an empty line, which is again for readability. And then the first thing that we do is call the write function to write this particular message that you see in single quotes to standard output or the terminal. Okay, so notice that write is being called as without an ln at the end. All right, so this is a different function from write ln, and the way this works is it simply writes hi to the screen space without a new line at the end. So whatever you end up writing next is going to go right next to it. Okay, so that's how write works. It doesn't put a new line at the end. Okay, what next? The next thing that we do is quite interesting. We write, again, without a new line, the first command line argument. So remember, sys.argv at 1 is the very first command line argument. And this is the name that we are reading from the user. So that's what gets written next. So some name that the user supplies, all right next to hi. Okay, and then finally we make a call to the write-ln function to write this message to the terminal. Okay, so whatever this writes goes next to name, so it's period space how are you. Okay, but since this is a write-ln, there is a new line character here, right? So there's a new line character which we typically write as \n, so it's a hidden character, it's a new line character. And since we are writing this with a new line, the prompt is then going to show up on the next line once the program is run. All right, so the prompt will be returned to you on a new line because a new line was written right after the message by this write-ln function. All right, so to recap, what this program does is it takes a name as a command line argument and it simply writes it to standard output along with a message. And the program is very simple. It has two import statements. We import stdio_sys, then a blank line, and then three calls to write, where the first write writes the string hi, the second write writes the first command line argument, the name that the user supplies, and then the write-ln writes this message, how are you, right next to the name. Right, but this message is written with a new line character at the end. So when the program is done, the prompt is returned to you on a new line. Okay. All right. Now notice that this program is what we call a data-driven program, meaning it receives some input from the outside world. So this program is capable of greeting a person with any name. Right? This name here that comes in as a command line argument is user input. Right? What this means is just because we want to greet a different person doesn't mean we have to modify the program. The same program can work and take any name as a command line argument and it can greet that person. Okay, so in that sense it is user controlled. I mean it's data driven, right? So you don't have to change the program just because you're greeting some other individual. Okay, so we'll see this in action very soon. So here is how you run the program. So in the first instance, what we are doing is we are running useArgument.py by saying python3 useArgument.py, and we supply our first command line argument, all right, as Alice. And what does the program do? Well, the program prints, hi Alice, how are you? Okay, so let's carefully try and make sense of this output. So where is this part of the output coming from? Hi, comma, space. Well, that is because of this this call to the write function. All right. What about this part here, Alice? Well, that's this guy here, this write, which takes the command line argument Alice. So Alice is the first command line argument, and that's what gets written by this write right next to hi. All right, because this guy was without a new line character. All right. Now, since this write is also without a new line character, whatever write-ln prints goes next to the name. So this part of the output, period, space, how are you, and so on, comes from this write-ln. All right. And since this message, how are you, was written with a new line character at the end, the prompt is showing up on a new line. Okay. All right, now we run the command again, but this time around we are greeting Bob. So the first command line argument is Bob, and the program responds by saying, hi, Bob, how are you? Okay, so notice that we ran the very same program with different names or command line arguments, and the program ends up greeting that particular individual. And then the third time around, we run it with the command line argument Carol, and the program greets Carol. So we didn't have to change the program at all. It's the same program that responds differently based on different command line arguments, right? Or different command line inputs. Okay. Now, here are some questions that you may want to think about. Let's say you run this program useArgument.py without specifying any command line argument. All right. So how would the program behave? Just think about it. So you're running useArgument.py without supplying any command line argument. The program surely expects one command line argument, but you're not giving it any. So what would the program's response be? Well, it turns out that in that case, it will happily execute this line, meaning you will see the output hi, comma, space. But then when it comes here, it is trying to access the first command line argument, but you haven't given it any, so that results in an error. So then you will see some error message and the program terminates. All right, so you'll see an error and the program terminates. Okay, so that's one scenario to think about. Here is another scenario. So let's say we run useArgument.py not with one command line argument, but with several. Let's say Bob and Carol and so on. So how would this program behave? So instead of one command line argument, we have given it 3, right? So here the program is simply going to ignore these two guys. Why? Because inside of the program, we just access the first command line argument. So it's going to pick up Alice and it's going to print out, hi, Alice, how are you? It's going to simply ignore the other command line arguments. Okay, so that's another scenario. And finally, here's a different scenario that you may want to think about. So let's say we run useArgument.py not this way, but by saying Alice space Bob space Carol. All right. So how is this program going to behave? Well, this goes back to what we talked about in the previous slide. So here, though Alice, Bob, and Carol, they are separated by spaces, the whole thing is embedded inside of double quotes. So this whole thing is basically a single command line argument that gets substituted for this argument here. Okay, so the way this program will work is it's going to print the message hi, comma, Alice, Bob, Carol, period, space, how are you, question mark. Okay. All right, so what we're saying here is that if you have a command line argument that has spaces in them, then you can embed that inside of double quotes, and in which case the whole thing is going to be looked at as a single command line argument. Okay, all right, well, that ends this lecture on your very first Python program. All right, so thanks for your time.